girl poisoned by her stepmother returns with a horrifying secret from heaven. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck rise and your pulse quicken. The night outside was cold, but inside the house, it felt like the temperature had dropped even further, as if something dark was lurking just beneath the surface. Lily's body lay still in the small, dark room. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the rustling of leaves outside, stirred by the wind. But it wasn't just the quiet that made the air feel heavy. It was the knowledge of what had happened, of who had done this to her. Her stepmother, Eleanor, had always been a figure of control. Always the one pulling the strings, always the one who seemed to have everything under her thumb. She was the kind of woman who could charm anyone with a smile, who could talk circles around you until you were convinced she was the answer to all your problems. But what people didn't know, what no one could have guessed, was the darkness that had taken root in her heart. Lily had been a quiet girl, reserved but full of promise. But Eleanor had seen her as a threat, a barrier between her and the wealth and power she craved. It had been subtle at first, slight changes in Lily's behavior, her health, things that no one thought much about. But then, as the days turned into weeks, it became impossible to ignore. The faint, bitter taste in Lily's food. The sudden weight loss. The dizziness. The nausea that wouldn't go away. And then one day Lily had collapsed. By the time anyone had noticed something was wrong, it was too late. Eleanor had already poisoned her. Slowly. Methodically. Undetected. The doctors said it was just a sudden, unexplained illness. No one suspected the woman who had been playing the part of the caring stepmother, the loving wife, so convincingly. But now, something was happening that no one could explain. Lily wasn't just gone, she was back. And she wasn't alone. It started with the whispers. Late at night, in the dead of sleep, Eleanor had heard faint, ghostly murmurs coming from the corners of the house. She thought she was just imagining things, her guilt manifesting as shadows in her mind. But the whispers persisted. They grew louder, clearer. "You killed me," the voice had said one night. So faint, but unmistakable. It was Lily's voice. Eleanor had tried to ignore it at first, tried to convince herself it was the house settling, or perhaps the wind playing tricks on her. But then the dreams came. The nightmares where Lily, pale and cold, stared at her with empty eyes, accusing her, condemning her. Each night, the dreams grew more vivid, more real. Each time, Eleanor woke in a cold sweat, her heart racing, her breath shallow. But that was just the beginning. Lily's return was not in the form of a ghostly apparition or a simple haunting. No, it was much worse than that. What Eleanor didn't know, what no one knew, was that Lily had taken a part of her tormentor with her when she died. A secret, a horrifying truth, had followed her into the afterlife, one that would change everything. Eleanor had always been the one in control, the one who held the power, but now, as she sat in her mansion, trembling under the weight of her own guilt, she realized she had lost it. The control, the illusion of safety, the power to walk away unscathed. There was a knock at the door, startling Eleanor from her thoughts. The house was empty, except for her, and the quiet that had settled into her bones. She couldn't bring herself to move, to face what was waiting on the other side of that door. She had spent years perfecting the facade of her life, but tonight, it felt like everything was crumbling down. She heard the door open slowly, and the hairs on her neck stood up. And then the voice came, just as chilling as it had been in her dreams. "You didn't think you could escape, did you?" Eleanor turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing in the doorway was not a ghost. It was Lily, but she was different, pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to stare into the very depths of her soul. Her hair was wild, unkempt, but her presence was unmistakable. I didn't mean to," Eleanor stammered, her mind racing for some sort of explanation, some excuse, anything that could absolve her of what she had done. "Lily, I never wanted this. I didn't mean to hurt you." But Lily's cold, lifeless eyes never wavered. "You killed me," she whispered again, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and grief. "And now I'm here to make you pay." The house felt suffocating, the walls closing in as the temperature dropped further. as if the very air itself was thickening with dread. Eleanor's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she realized what she had done. It wasn't just that Lily was back. It was that she had come for revenge. Eleanor tried to turn, tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was frozen in place, paralyzed by the fear of what Lily had become. But it wasn't just Lily who haunted her now. It was the secret she had hidden so long, the one that tied them both together. A sudden, disturbing thought flashed in Eleanor's mind. A piece of information she had buried deep. A horrifying truth that she had tried to forget. She hadn't been the only one to make a decision in that house. There had been another player. Someone watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Someone powerful, influential, who had known all along. And in that moment, Eleanor realized that the web of lies had stretched further than she had ever imagined. The villain behind the curtain was closer than she thought, and far more dangerous. As she looked into Lily's cold, accusatory eyes, she felt the weight of an even darker truth settling over her. This was only the beginning. Eleanor's breath was shallow, and her heart hammered against her ribs. The sight of Lily standing in the doorway, her figure pale and ghostly, was enough to paralyze her in place. Her mind raced, desperately seeking a way to escape the nightmare unfolding before her. She had always been in control, always been the one to hold the reins, to manage her life and the lives of those around her. But now, it seemed that everything she had built was crashing down, piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The girl, her stepdaughter, stood there, the lifelessness in her eyes a chilling reminder of the crime Eleanor had committed. The poison, the slow and calculated torment she had inflicted on Lily for months, had taken its toll. She had watched her daughter grow weaker, more fragile, all the while hiding the truth behind her cold smile. And now, that same girl was standing in front of her, but she wasn't the child Eleanor had poisoned. She was something darker, something vengeful. "Lily, please," Eleanor stammered, her voice trembling. She took a hesitant step back, as if distance could protect her from the horror in front of her. "You? You're not real. This isn't real. You're just a hallucination. You can't be here." Lily's expression remained unchanged, her eyes as empty as the hollowed-out version of the child she had once been. "You think you can hide from what you've done?" she asked softly, her voice like a whisper carried on a breeze, chilling to the bone. "You can't run, Eleanor. I know what you did, and I'm not going to let you forget it." The words cut through Eleanor like a knife. Her mind raced to make sense of it all. She had never imagined that Lily could return. She thought she had gotten away with it. She had been so careful, so precise in her planning. The poison had been undetectable. The doctors had chalked it up to some inexplicable illness. No one had suspected a thing. But now, here was Lily, alive, or something close to it, and she knew everything. I never meant for this to happen," Eleanor muttered, her voice barely a whisper. She looked away, unable to meet Lily's gaze. "I didn't want to hurt you. You were in the way. I didn't want to lose him, to lose everything." Her hands trembled as she clutched them to her chest, her mind spinning with guilt and regret. "You were weak, and you wouldn't listen. You never understood why it had to be this way." Lily's eyes never left her. "You never understood what you were doing either," she said coldly. Her voice didn't waver. "You took my life because you were too selfish to see what was right in front of you. And now you'll have to face the consequences." Eleanor's stomach churned. The room seemed to close in around her as the suffocating air made it harder to breathe. She staggered backward, her back hitting the wall with a soft thud. "Please, I'm sorry," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. The remorse, real and raw, began to claw its way to the surface, but it felt futile, like trying to grasp at the wind. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to?" Lily interrupted, her voice rising with barely contained rage. "You did mean it. You planned it. You poisoned me. You took everything from me, and now I'm here to take it back." Eleanor's mind reeled, the weight of her actions finally crashing down on her with full force. She had been so blinded by ambition and greed, by the need to maintain her image, her power, that she had been willing to destroy the life of an innocent child. And now that child, or the thing pretending to be her, was standing before her, holding her accountable in a way she couldn't have imagined. But what terrified Eleanor more than anything was not just the anger in Lily's voice, not just the knowledge that her secret had been exposed. What terrified her was the presence of something much darker, something that seemed to swirl around Lily, something that wasn't natural. The very air in the room had become heavy, charged with a malevolent energy. The lights flickered above her head, casting long, stretching shadows that danced across the walls. Eleanor's chest tightened, and she staggered forward, her legs weak beneath her. "What do you want from me?" she gasped, her voice desperate. I've already paid. I've lost everything. I lost him. I lost my life, my future, please." But Lily's figure didn't soften. She didn't show mercy. Instead, her presence seemed to intensify, her image flickering like a candle flame on the brink of going out. "You think losing him was a punishment?" Lily's voice was low, almost taunting. "You think losing your future is enough to make up for what you've done to me? To my life? You'll pay far more than that." Suddenly, there was a shift in the room. The temperature dropped sharply, and a low hum began to fill the silence. It was as if something was building in the air, some unseen force gathering strength. Eleanor's breath came faster as she tried to make sense of it, her panic escalating. And then Lily stepped forward. Her eyes glowed now, not with the warmth of a living person, but with something darker, something unnatural. Eleanor's heart raced as she stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she fell to the floor, staring up at Lily in terror. "You can't escape," Lily said, her voice a mixture of pity and cold satisfaction. "You wanted power. You wanted control. But in the end, all you've done is lock yourself in your own prison." Eleanor looked around, but the walls seemed to close in even more. The shadows on the floor seemed to twist, creeping toward her as if they had a life of their own. Every inch of the room felt wrong, like it was part of a nightmare, a prison with no way out. The words, "You'll never escape," echoed in her mind, and as she tried to scramble to her feet, she felt a cold hand wrap around her throat, pulling her back down. The pressure was suffocating, overwhelming, and her vision began to blur. The room spun, and for the first time, Eleanor felt truly powerless. "You'll never escape what you've done to me," Lily whispered, her voice fading as everything around Eleanor went dark. Eleanor's eyes snapped open, her body jerking upward as if she had been yanked from a deep, suffocating sleep. Her breath was erratic, shallow, and her hands instinctively flew to her neck, as if to confirm the crushing weight that had been placed there only moments ago. But there was nothing, no cold hand, no pressure, just the pounding of her heart in her chest, the echo of a terrifying presence that still lingered in the air. She was in her bedroom, lying on the floor, tangled in the covers, a sheen of sweat covering her face. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of moonlight creeping through the curtains. But something was different. It felt wrong. The stillness in the room seemed to hum with tension, and Eleanor could feel it crawling up her spine. She had been here before. She had felt this before. The weight of guilt, of fear, pressing against her chest, suffocating her every breath. But this was something far more sinister. Slowly, she pushed herself up to sit against the bed, her eyes darting around the room, half expecting to see Lily standing there again, staring at her with those cold, empty eyes. The vision of her stepdaughter, the twisted reflection of the girl she had poisoned, haunted Eleanor's every thought. The ghostly image of Lily, accusing her, blaming her, it felt so real. Too real. Had it been a dream? A nightmare? Or had Lily truly come back from the dead? Eleanor's hands trembled as she wiped the sweat from her brow, trying to steady her racing thoughts. The room felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. The air seemed heavier, filled with something dark, something alive. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking, waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for her to slip. She glanced at the clock on her nightstand. It was nearly 3 in the morning. No one would be awake to hear her if something happened. No one could help her. The house was silent, eerily so, as if the world outside had gone still. But she knew it wasn't silence. It was waiting. The house was waiting. Suddenly, the soft creak of the floorboards in the hallway broke the silence. Eleanor froze. Her breath hitched in her throat as she turned toward the door. The air around her seemed to thicken, the darkness in the room seeming to stretch and pull. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The creak came again, this time louder, closer. The floorboards outside her room groaned under the weight of footsteps. Eleanor's eyes widened as the handle of the door began to turn slowly, the soft click echoing through the room. Her heart pounded in her chest, her pulse quickening as the door creaked open. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't Lily standing there. Not at first. But the figure in the doorway was familiar enough to send a chill down Eleanor's spine. The man standing there, silhouetted by the faint moonlight, was someone she knew well. His towering figure, his stern, arrogant face, the cold gleam in his eyes, it was all too familiar. The man stepped forward, his shoes tapping against the floor with a rhythmic, almost predatory echo. It was Arthur Green, Eleanor's late husband, Lily's father. But he was wrong. His body was slightly bent, as if it were resisting some invisible force. His skin was pale, his eyes hollow and sunken, like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Arthur?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible, thick with fear. What are you doing here?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes locked onto her with a terrifying intensity. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt a sense of dread that she had never known when her husband had been alive. "Arthur, please," she said, her voice breaking. This isn't real. You're dead. You're not real." But Arthur didn't speak. He simply stared at her, unblinking, his lips curling into a slow, almost imperceptible smirk. Then, as if driven by some force beyond his control, he raised a hand, his bony fingers extended toward her. The air around him seemed to grow colder, more oppressive, as if the temperature in the room had dropped to freezing. Eleanor gasped for air, but the room felt like it was closing in on her. The air was thick with an unnatural pressure, and the darkness swelled as though it had a mind of its own. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. "Arthur?" Eleanor whispered again, her voice trembling. Please don't. I didn't mean to." Before she could finish, Arthur's form flickered, the shadows around him distorting, and suddenly he was gone. Just like that. The silence returned to the room, only now it felt colder, more suffocating. Eleanor's heart was racing. Her breaths came in shallow, panicked gasps. What was happening? Was she losing her mind? She rose to her feet unsteadily, her legs shaking beneath her as she stumbled toward the door. She had to get out of this room. She had to get out of the house. But the moment her hand touched the door handle, it felt like the house itself was closing in around her, trapping her. The walls were too close. The air was too heavy. The house was alive with something sinister. Something dark. Eleanor turned around, her eyes searching the room in a frantic panic. She had to leave. But no matter how fast she moved, no matter how hard she tried to escape, she couldn't get away from the suffocating presence that seemed to follow her every step. The shadows were closing in, pressing against her, until it felt as if the very room itself was alive, suffocating her with its cold, bitter grasp. Suddenly, Lily's voice echoed through the room again, soft and chilling, like a memory whispered from the past. "You can't escape, Eleanor. You never will." Eleanor froze, her blood turning to ice as the voice seemed to come from every direction, from inside her mind, from the very walls of the house. It was real. This wasn't just guilt. This wasn't a haunting. It was something much darker. Something far more terrifying. She had awakened something in Lily. Something that she couldn't control. And now, she was going to have to pay the price. Eleanor's hands shook as she gripped the door handle, her knuckles white, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The weight of the darkness in the room pressed in around her, suffocating her every breath. She could feel it, an overwhelming presence, as though the very walls of the house had turned against her. The air was thick, almost viscous, and each step she took felt like she was wading through a swamp of dread. Lily's voice echoed again, softer now, but no less chilling. "You can't escape, Eleanor. You never will." Her words scraped against Eleanor's mind, carving out deeper fear with each repetition. It was as though Lily was everywhere, inside the walls, inside her head, taunting her with the unbearable weight of what she had done. The house, once a place of comfort and control, now felt like a prison, each room a cell, each corner a reminder of the sin Eleanor had committed. She turned away from the door, her back pressing against it, as though she could somehow block out the presence that filled the room. But it was no use. The shadows twisted and writhed like they had a life of their own, swirling around her feet, creeping up the walls, and blotting out the faint moonlight that had once illuminated the room. Eleanor's eyes darted to the bed, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw something. A figure, a shadowy outline, standing in the corner of the room, watching her. But when she blinked, it was gone. She took a step back, a cold sweat breaking out across her skin. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat reverberating in her ears, drowning out the distant sound of her breath. What was happening to her? Was this real? Was Lily truly back from the dead, or was this some cruel manifestation of her own guilt? She couldn't tell anymore. A sudden sound, a soft tap on the floor, brought her back to the present. She froze, staring at the floor beneath her. The shadows in the room shifted again, moving like a dark tide, and as she watched, they began to gather at the foot of the bed. A chill ran through her. Eleanor couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The silence that followed was oppressive, pregnant with dread. And then, without warning, the shadows started to coalesce, swirling into a figure. A small, distorted form that rose up from the floor like a nightmare taking shape. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat, and her legs felt like they might give way beneath her. There, in the center of the room, was Lily, but this time, she wasn't just a ghostly apparition. She was something else. Something darker. Lily's form was translucent, her body flickering in and out of existence, but her eyes, they were the same. Cold, empty. And they were locked onto Eleanor with a chilling intensity that made her skin crawl. The girl's once bright eyes were now hollow, lifeless. Her skin, once soft and youthful, was now pale and ashen, as though she were a puppet of death itself. "You killed me," Lily's voice rasped, her words harsh and grating like a blade cutting through Eleanor's mind. "You took my life, and now you'll pay for it." Eleanor stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. "No. No, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to. I never wanted this. I never meant to hurt you." But Lily didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her very presence was a condemnation. She floated toward Eleanor, her movements unnaturally smooth, as if she were gliding on air, and with each step, the temperature in the room dropped lower and lower until Eleanor's breath turned to fog. "You think you can beg for forgiveness?" Lily asked, her voice now a low, mocking whisper. "You think you can erase what you did?" Eleanor tried to speak, tried to find the words to explain herself, to tell Lily that she was sorry, that she had never meant for any of this to happen. But the words caught in her throat. It was too late for apologies. Too late for regrets. She had taken the life of an innocent child, slowly, methodically, with a poison that had made sure Lily's suffering would be prolonged. Lily reached out, her hand floating toward Eleanor's face, cold as ice. Eleanor recoiled instinctively, but her legs couldn't move. She couldn't escape. The pressure in the room was unbearable, the air thick with dread. "You're going to feel what I felt," Lily whispered. "You'll live with this. Forever." Eleanor gasped, her body trembling as Lily's cold fingers brushed her cheek. It felt like fire and ice combined, painful, searing, yet numb all at once. She could feel Lily's rage, her anguish. But it was more than that. There was something else in the air now, a deeper, darker presence, like an entity that had followed Lily back from wherever she had gone. A voice echoed in the distance, one that didn't belong to Lily. It was deep, authoritative, with a terrifying edge of malice. The words reverberated through Eleanor's mind like a drumbeat, shaking her to her core. "You thought you could get away with this," the voice rumbled. "It wasn't human. It was something else. But I see everything." Eleanor's pulse quickened, her breath coming in frantic gasps. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to shift again, more violently this time. Something else was there, lurking in the darkness, something even worse than the figure of Lily. Something that watched her. And it knew everything. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. Eleanor's eyes widened as she saw it, a tall, looming figure, wearing an expensive suit. His face was unmistakable. It was the man from the photographs, the man who had been the catalyst for Eleanor's greed. The man who had made her believe that she had to do what she did to secure her future. It was Theodore Marks, the wealthy businessman who had promised her the life she had always dreamed of, a life built on the bones of others. And now, standing in her bedroom, in the center of the darkness, he grinned. Eleanor's heart slammed against her chest as she looked at the man who had stepped out from the shadows. Theodore Marks, tall, imposing, his expensive suit a mockery of everything she had ever wanted. His face, stern but with a grotesque smugness, was like a reminder of all the choices she had made, the deals she had struck, and the price she had been willing to pay for her ambition. But this wasn't just a man. This was something else. This was the embodiment of everything she had become. The ruthless, the calculating, the selfish. And now, as he stood before her, she understood with sickening clarity that her actions had summoned a force she couldn't control. Theodore, Eleanor's voice cracked as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Her mind was spinning, her body trembling in fear and confusion. This wasn't just Lily's return. This wasn't just the revenge of an innocent child. This was something far darker, a collision of sins, of decisions made in desperation, of promises that could never be kept. "You thought you could escape," Theodore said, his voice smooth and rich, dripping with the same smug arrogance that had made him so successful. He took a slow step toward her, his presence suffocating the room. "You thought you could poison her, get rid of the obstacle, and everything would fall into place. That I would give you what you wanted, what we agreed upon." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had known Theodore for years, had been entangled with him in ways she couldn't fully admit to herself. He was the businessman, the man who had promised her a life of wealth and luxury, one where she would no longer have to struggle, no longer have to fight to maintain her power. He was the reason she had done it, the reason she had poisoned Lily. But now, as he stood there in front of her, she realized that he was just another piece in a much larger, darker puzzle. Theodore wasn't just a partner in crime. He was the architect of her undoing. He was the one who had fed her the lies, the promises that had ultimately led her down this path of destruction. "You promised me," Eleanor gasped, her voice trembling with desperation. "You said that if I got rid of her, if I took care of her, I would get everything I wanted. The house, the fortune, everything. You promised?" Theodore smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a man who had kept his promises. It was the smile of a predator, one who had always known what was coming next. "Oh, Eleanor," he said, his tone condescending, like a teacher explaining something to a slow student. "I promised you nothing. You did this for yourself. You poisoned her because you wanted what you wanted. You didn't do it for me. You did it for you." His words hit her like a slap to the face. The truth was undeniable now. She had been nothing more than a pawn in a much bigger game. She had thought she was in control, that she was playing the system, but in the end, it had been Theodore pulling the strings. He had known she was weak, that she would be easy to manipulate. And now, here she was, trapped in a nightmare of her own making. "You lied to me," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking with betrayal. You promised we'd be together. That we'd..." Theodore cut her off with a sharp laugh. "You think this is about you and me?" His voice was sharp, mocking. "This was never about you. It was about power, about control. You were always just a means to an end, Eleanor. Always." Eleanor staggered back, as if his words had physically struck her. Her legs buckled and she fell to the floor, her head spinning. The weight of everything that had happened, everything she had done, was too much to bear. The guilt, the fear, the betrayal, it all crashed over her like a wave, drowning her in its depth. And then, like a dark echo from the past, Lily's voice returned, louder this time, more forceful. "You thought you could escape me," Lily said, her voice filled with fury and accusation. "You thought you could kill me and get away with it. But I'm still here. And now, you'll never be free. The room grew colder, the air thick with dread as the figure of Lily materialized again, this time more solid, more real. Her form flickered like a flame on the edge of going out, but there was something unmistakably powerful about her now. She wasn't just a victim of Eleanor's cruelty. She was something else, something born of vengeance and anger. Theodore took a step back, his smirk faltering as he looked at the ghostly figure of Lily. "You?" His voice faltered, and for the first time, Eleanor saw fear in his eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. "You shouldn't be here. You should be gone." Lily's eyes locked onto his, burning with a rage that only death could fuel. "I'm not gone. I'm never gone." Eleanor turned toward Lily, her body trembling with terror. The truth of what had happened, what she had done to this innocent girl, hit her with such force that she thought she might suffocate under the weight of it. Lily had been the key, the catalyst. But there was something more. There was a secret, a horrifying truth that Eleanor had buried deep inside, something that had been waiting to be exposed. The moment Lily had been poisoned, Eleanor had set into motion something far darker than she had realized. Lily's return wasn't just about revenge, it was about something bigger, something connected to Theodore, something that linked them all in a twisted web of deception. Theodore took another step back, his face paling, but it was too late. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, closing in around him, as if the house itself were rejecting him, pushing him away. He looked toward the door, but it was no longer an escape. "You didn't think I would leave you here, did you?" Lily's voice was full of cruel satisfaction. "You made me suffer. And now, I'll make sure you suffer too." Eleanor stared at the two figures, Lily, her face twisted with rage, and Theodore, who now seemed like a broken man, his bravado slipping away. The room had turned into a battleground, and the stakes were higher than she could have imagined. Eleanor's heart slammed against her chest as she looked at the man who had stepped out from the shadows. There was no mistaking him. He was unmistakable, tall, imposing, his suit sharp and immaculate, but it was his presence, his arrogance, that made Eleanor's blood run cold. It was him. Theodore Marks, a man she had trusted, a man who had promised her everything she ever wanted. But now, standing in front of her, it was as though she was facing the personification of everything she had sacrificed her soul for. Except it wasn't Theodore Marks anymore. It was Trump, the man who had been her silent accomplice, her enabler, the man who had made promises to her. The one whose wealth, power, and ruthlessness had driven her to commit murder for the sake of ambition. But now, standing before her, it was clear, his power wasn't just in money, but in manipulation, control, and an almost supernatural ability to get others to bend to his will. "Eleanor," Trump said, his voice low and self-assured, the arrogance dripping from his every word. He took a step forward, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. "You really thought you could get away with this? You thought you could poison her and walk away scot-free?" Eleanor's mouth went dry. She knew those eyes. She knew that sneer. It was the same look he gave people when he was about to claim victory, when he had already won the game. His words felt like daggers in her heart, but she knew she could never back out of the deal she'd made. She had already signed her soul away. I didn't have a choice," Eleanor stammered, her voice trembling. "You promised we'd have everything we wanted. I did what you asked me to do." Trump's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Oh, Eleanor," his voice was thick with disdain. "You always had a choice. You just didn't think far enough ahead, did you?" He took another step toward her, towering over her as she recoiled, feeling like a helpless insect in his gaze. "You thought you could outsmart me, outmaneuver me, but in the end, you were just another pawn." Eleanor's mind raced. Her thoughts were frantic as she tried to make sense of it all. Trump, her partner in this twisted scheme, had known all along. She had believed that by killing Lily, she would secure her future. She would have the power, the fortune, the life she had always dreamed of. But now, it was clear that Trump had been playing a different game entirely. She had been nothing more than a tool to him, a means to an end. "You told me I'd get everything," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with disbelief and fear. "You said we'd have it all. The money, the power, everything." Trump's laughter rang out in the cold room, dark and mocking. "You really thought I cared about your little schemes, didn't you?" His voice dropped, turning menacing. "You were just a stepping stone. A tool. That's all you've ever been, Eleanor." Eleanor took a step back, her legs nearly giving way beneath her. You lied to me." She could barely form the words, her voice hoarse with the sting of betrayal. "You promised me we would be together." Trump interrupted her, cutting her off with a sharp, venomous laugh. "Together?" He scoffed. "You're nothing to me. I got everything I wanted and I used you to get it. That's all you were, nothing more than a tool to help me get ahead." Eleanor's mind spun with the realization. She had thought she was in control, thought that by getting rid of Lily, she would solidify her place by his side. But the truth hit her with brutal clarity. She had been nothing but a means to an end, a way for Trump to secure even more wealth and power. And now, standing here, in this nightmare, she realized she had made a terrible mistake. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, the chill seeping into her bones. The shadows in the corners of the room began to twist and stretch, growing longer, as if they had minds of their own. Lily's presence was still here, and she could feel it, creeping into every corner, wrapping around her like an invisible force. Trump's eyes narrowed, his expression twisting into something almost predatory. "Do you know what happens to people like you, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice dripping with malice. "You get used. You get tossed aside when you're no longer needed. You think you're special? You think I give a damn about you?" Eleanor's breath quickened as her legs trembled beneath her, unable to move. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Trump's face twisted into a smirk. "I don't want anything from you anymore. You've already done your part." His eyes gleamed with something darker. "But now, it's time for you to understand what happens when you cross me." Eleanor's eyes flickered to the door, but she couldn't make herself move. The walls felt like they were closing in. She was trapped. The shadow of Lily's ghost, of her past sins, loomed over her, suffocating her with every breath. And as Trump's figure seemed to swell, looming over her with an aura of power and menace, she realized there was nowhere left to run. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Trump stepped back. But the room didn't feel any less suffocating. The presence of Lily was heavier now, more intense, as if the very air had thickened with her presence. And then, the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if something far more powerful than Lily's ghost was moving in the shadows. Lily's voice, colder than ever, broke the silence. "It's too late for apologies, Eleanor. You can't hide from what you've done. You never could." The room seemed to pulse, the walls shaking as the shadows writhed. Eleanor was no longer sure where the room ended and where her nightmare began. And as she looked at the cruel figure of Trump, his face now twisted with a satisfaction that made her stomach churn, she realized the price of her ambition, her greed, had only just begun. She could feel the darkness pressing against her chest, her breaths shallow and uneven. Every inch of the room was saturated with dread, and the shadows that clung to the corners seemed to pulse, as if alive. Lily's voice, cold and filled with vengeance, echoed in her mind, louder now, filling the space with a deafening presence. "You can't escape," Lily whispered again, but this time, the words felt like an inescapable sentence. Eleanor's mind raced, struggling to make sense of the terror that seemed to rise and fall with the swell of Lily's voice. Was this real? Was she really standing in the presence of the daughter she had murdered, or was this some twisted nightmare? The room grew colder, and Eleanor shivered violently, her teeth chattering against the biting chill. The air felt so thick, so oppressive, that it was impossible to breathe properly. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she slowly turned her gaze toward the figure of Trump, still standing in the doorway, his smug expression barely concealed behind a veneer of mockery. "You still don't understand," Trump said, his voice calm, almost too calm, like he was enjoying every moment of Eleanor's unraveling. "You thought you could manipulate me, that you could use me to get what you wanted. But you were just a pawn in my game. A tool. A disposable tool." Eleanor's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, the weight of the words pressing down on her with an unbearable force. All the lies, all the manipulation, the months of plotting, It was all for nothing. She had given everything, sacrificed everything, for a future that never existed. She had trusted him, trusted his promises, but now she saw the truth. He never cared about her. He never cared about any of them. You killed your own flesh and blood, Trump continued, his words like ice daggers in her soul. And now you'll pay the price. You wanted power, but you didn't realize what it would cost you. Your soul. Your life. Tears began to fall from Eleanor's eyes, hot and relentless, streaking down her cheeks. She could feel the pressure of guilt pushing against her chest, squeezing the breath out of her. She could still hear Lily's voice, soft, accusing, filled with all the pain and sorrow of a life taken too soon. "Why did you do it, Eleanor?" Lily asked, her voice no longer filled with anger, but with something darker, something filled with sorrow and an unspoken understanding. "Why did you take my life?" Eleanor opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She had no defense. There was nothing she could say to justify what she had done, to explain the poison she had slowly fed to her own daughter. The whispers of guilt were deafening now, louder than anything else. The truth of what she had done hung over her like a guillotine waiting to drop. "I needed it," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "I needed everything. I thought that if I got rid of you, I could have it all. The house. The power. The life I always wanted. I thought it would fix everything. I was desperate." Trump's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a smile. "Desperation, Eleanor? You don't get to use that as an excuse. You killed your daughter for your own gain. You killed her, and now look at you. You're nothing." The shadows seemed to deepen, and the room felt like it was suffocating her, closing in tighter and tighter until she couldn't breathe. And then, in the middle of the suffocating darkness, Lily appeared again, her pale face glowing with an eerie light, her eyes filled with the cold, unrelenting fury of a soul denied justice. "You killed me," Lily whispered, but this time, the words were different. They were softer, sadder, as if a weight had lifted from her. "But I'm still here. And now, you will see what it costs to steal a life." The temperature in the room plunged, and Eleanor's breath turned to mist in front of her face. The room, once filled with warmth and comfort, had turned into something unrecognizable, a dark, suffocating prison. And in the center of it all stood Lily, her figure flickering like a dying flame. "No, please," Eleanor gasped, her voice desperate as she reached out for Lily, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Lily didn't respond. Instead, her figure seemed to ripple, distorting, becoming more and more translucent until she seemed to fade completely from view. Eleanor's heart raced, her panic rising as the room grew colder, darker, more oppressive. She was alone again. But she knew she wasn't truly alone. The shadows were watching her, waiting for her to break, for her to acknowledge what she had done. And then, the voice of Trump broke through the silence, his words laced with cruel satisfaction. "You thought you could hide in here. You thought you could get away with it all. But now, Eleanor, you're trapped. In your mind. In your own guilt. You will never escape what you've done." Eleanor clutched her head, her hands trembling as she tried to shut out the noise, the weight of it all crashing down on her. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she couldn't distinguish between reality and the nightmare that had taken root in her mind. She was spiraling, trapped in a prison of her own making, a victim of her own greed and lies. But then, in the midst of the chaos, a different voice cut through the darkness. It was softer, more gentle, but no less filled with truth. "It's not too late, Eleanor," Lily's voice said again, this time without the anger. There was a sadness in it, a mournful quality that made Eleanor pause. "You can still choose. You can still choose to make it right." Eleanor's eyes widened as she turned toward the voice. This wasn't just Lily. It was something else, something more than she had expected. The shadow in the room flickered again, and for a brief moment, Eleanor saw a glimpse of what could be her redemption, a way to undo the evil she had set in motion. But the choice was hers. Eleanor's hands trembled as she stood in the center of the room, the weight of her choices pressing down on her like a 1,000-ton weight. The shadows had faded, the oppressive chill had lifted, but the guilt remained. It gnawed at her, a constant reminder of the terrible things she had done. She had poisoned her daughter. She had murdered Lily for the promise of wealth, of power, only to realize that in doing so, she had killed the very thing that made her human. And yet, something had changed. When Lily had spoken to her one final time, there was no longer the anger that had driven the haunting, no longer the fury that had consumed her ghostly form. Instead, Lily had shown her something else. A choice. A way out of the darkness that had held Eleanor captive for so long. The house was still. The eerie weight of the presence that had haunted her seemed to have dissipated. But Eleanor knew she had not been granted peace just yet. The redemption she longed for, the absolution she needed, wasn't something anyone could simply give her. It had to come from within. She had to earn it. And that would be the hardest part. But for the first time, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope. It was faint, like the first light of dawn after an endless night. She had been given a second chance, a chance to make amends for her sins. Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped toward the front door. The night was still and quiet, but she knew what she had to do. She couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the damage she had caused, but she could make the choice to change the future. With each step she took toward the door, a burden seemed to lift from her shoulders, not completely, but enough to let her breathe. The guilt would remain, like a scar that would never truly heal. But in that moment, Eleanor understood the lesson Lily had shown her. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about owning it. It was about accepting responsibility and choosing to live differently. She opened the door and stepped outside. The cool air of the night hit her face, but it didn't feel suffocating anymore. The weight of the house, of the secrets that had been buried within its walls, no longer pressed against her chest. She was free, free to choose, free to live. And in the quiet of the night, Eleanor whispered a prayer. She didn't ask for forgiveness, for that was something she knew she would have to work for, something she would have to earn over time. Instead, she simply thanked Lily for showing her the way forward, for reminding her that even in the deepest darkness, there was a path to the light. She closed her eyes, inhaling the night air deeply, and for the first time in years, felt the faintest stirrings of peace. She would never forget what she had done. She would carry that pain with her for the rest of her life. But she could finally see the possibility of a life beyond the shadows.